So the NBA playoffs are here, and it's one of my favorite parts of the year, right? All these competitive games, there's so many storylines going on, but you know what would be really cool? If half the teams didn't have their best player hurt in the first round. Okay, half might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but like in terms of guys that either aren't playing or clearly aren't 100%, we've got Joel Embiid. I don't think Tyrese Halliburton is 100% healthy. Zion is missing games. Jimmy Butler is missing games. Giannis is missing games. Those are five of the most important players in the entirety of the postseason, and none of them are playing. And this could possibly be connected to some of the rules changes that went in effect for the NBA this season. They basically implemented this rule that said you had to play a certain number of minutes in a certain number of games throughout the entirety of the regular season in order to be eligible for any of the season-long awards or to make an All-NBA team. You got to play 65 games in order to be eligible for those, and you can't just play 1 minute and then dip. You actually have to play a good amount of minutes in the game. And potentially as a result of this rule, we've got a lot of guys hurt to begin the postseason. Now, in fairness, some of the guys that I listed there, Embiid, Zion, even to an extent Jimmy Butler, not exactly the most durable players of all time in the postseason. And you could certainly argue that these were just kind of freak injuries, right? I mean, Jimmy Butler had someone fall on his leg and hurt his knee. Zion went up for a layup and just pulled his hamstring. Like there's nothing necessarily saying that the 65 game rule is the reason why these guys are hurt, but it is interesting that what feels like the most injury riddled first round that we've had in a while coincides with a season in which the league changed the rules to basically force these guys to play more games. Now, of course, the reason why the NBA made these changes, why they added these rules, is because they want guys to play more games. Load management, in a lot of people's eyes, got completely out of control over the last handful of seasons. And yes, it's an issue for the league in terms of, broadcast partners. You have a big national TV game, it's Lakers Nuggets, and all of a sudden LeBron and AD both aren't playing. They're not necessarily hurt, but they played 2 days ago and now they're taking the night off. That was a huge issue for the league, and they were trying to figure out a way to regulate that, to have guys play more games. And by and large, it worked. A lot more guys played a lot more games. And, something we're going to talk about later, I think a couple of guys also tried to come back too early from their injuries compared to how they would before because they really wanted to reach that 65 game threshold. But the thing that I think is more important about why the NBA implemented the 65 game rule is it became a consumer issue. Think about there are plenty of NBA fans that love the league that go to like one game a year, right? And a lot of times it ends up being let's say that you live in Orlando or you live somewhere in one of these Eastern Conference teams and the Lakers come to your city one time a year and all you want to do the entire year you save up, you want to go see LeBron play. And then he ends up getting scratched for load management the one time a year that he's in Atlanta or Orlando or any of these Eastern Conference teams. That is a huge consumer issue for the NBA because then those fans aren't going to buy tickets anymore. If you pay for the most expensive game on the calendar and then the guy doesn't even play and all of a sudden you're watching Taurean Prince jack up threes and you paid $300 for the ticket, not an ideal consumer experience. And I think that, yes, it was important. They wanted the national TV games to be a bigger deal. They're negotiating a new TV deal. That was obviously a big part of this. But I would argue that the bigger part is that the NBA wanted to make sure that guys were playing when they were healthy, as long as that didn't mean that they were then going to get hurt down the road. The problem is, there's obviously no way to prove this as a result of this video, but it is certainly concerning that we have so many injuries in the first round of the postseason in the first year that they changed these rules. Because like I said earlier, for the most part, it did work. LeBron played a ton of games. A lot of these guys played a ton of games. And even players that did suffer injuries in the middle of the season tried to come back earlier than maybe you thought that they would. I think there were a few games that Joel Embiid played that he would not have played prior to this 65 game rule being implemented. I think Tyrese Halliburton is another guy that probably came back from his injury in the middle of the year earlier than you would have expected him to. And both of those guys are now dealing with injury issues. I'm not necessarily going to say as a result, but within the same season in which all of these things changed. Now, of course, we know that the NBA is going to deny any kind of a connection between the 65 game rule and increased injuries to stars in the first round of the playoffs, because they have said for years that load management wasn't really a thing. It wasn't actually that helpful. It wasn't actually, giving more longevity to these players' careers. It wasn't allowing them to be healthy during the regular season. They've said that for years. So, of course, they're not going to say that there's any kind of connection, but it is worth monitoring over the next couple of seasons because they're going to keep this rule in place and they're going to continue to try and find ways to take away this load management idea from the NBA and from the league itself. And the real question here is, if it was up to you, would you rather guys play 55 games in a season maybe skip a couple of games during the year that they would normally play, but they want to make sure that they're fully healthy for the postseason. Now, let's just say, for example, that they play 55 games and they're fully healthy in the first round, or they play 65 games and there's like an 80% chance that they're healthy in the first round, a 20% chance that they're not. To me, that's a really difficult equation, right? Because if you're someone that's going to games or really excited about the national TV regular season games, yeah, you want guys to play. You want Paul George to play. You want Kawhi Leonard to play. But on the other hand, some of these games in the first round have felt very strange because there's no Jimmy Butler, because there's no Zion, because there's no Giannis. And yes, those guys specifically, they're kind of just like freak injuries. Giannis is just dribbling the ball up the floor and hurts his calf. Jimmy Butler, someone landing on his leg. Zion just pulls his hamstring on the way up to the rim. So there's not necessarily a causation of this on the surface, but it is at least worth thinking about how this rule could have potentially impacted the injury situation in the first round and whether or not that's a problem. And basically, here's where I've landed on this. Injuries are always going to play a much bigger part in the regular season and the postseason in the NBA than we want them to. If anybody could just hit a button and say that injuries weren't a thing, that would be fantastic. Everybody would do that 100% of the time. And there are always going to be teams that in a given season might have been able to push for a championship, lose early in the playoffs because someone got hurt. And there's always going to be teams that maybe have an easier path to make a good run in the postseason because the team that they're playing against got hurt. That is one of the variables every single season within the NBA is injuries, whether it be in the short term or potentially season long. And to me, it's certainly a positive that by and large throughout the league, everybody that was able to play more games this year. And it's clear that they are capable of playing the 65 games as long as they don't suffer a significant injury, because before they implemented this rule, it was very common for stars to play 55, 60 games, not due to any one individual injury, but just because of load management throughout the season. And so where I've landed with this is, generally speaking, the 65 game rule in the NBA, although I was skeptical about its implementation in the beginning of the year, actually did accomplish what the league wanted it to. Guys did play more games. Even guys that in the past notoriously missed a ton of games, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, these guys still played a lot. LeBron played a lot of games. Anthony Davis played a lot of games. And that is absolutely a positive. The thing that I would be concerned about in terms of possibly connecting the 65 game rule to first round playoff injuries would be what might have happened with Tyrese Halliburton and Joel Embiid this year, where guys came back from injury too quickly because they wanted to reach that 65 game threshold. Because it's not just because the vanity of players wanting to, make an All-NBA team. There are contractual incentives involved in making All-NBA teams, in winning MVP awards. You can make more money on a max contract by making an All-NBA team, by winning an MVP, by winning Defensive Player of the Year. And you're not eligible for those awards unless you play the 65 games. So if they really wanted to make sure that guys were playing the 65 games if they were healthy, but then they also weren't pushing themselves to come back early because they want to try and make more money, then remove those incentives in the next CBA. When you go back and look at how you want the Supermax contracts to be structured, take away the All-NBA and the award incentives out of the contract structure, because guys want to win those awards already. They want that on their resume. They want that on their legacy. But then to add contractual incentive to return early to play 65 games and potentially injure yourself in the long term, and how that could negatively impact the postseason product, that to me is the biggest issue here. Take those contractual incentives away. Guys want to make All-NBA. They want to win individual awards, but it shouldn't be something where they feel pressured to come back to reach the 65 game rule if they're not actually 100% healthy. But I still like the idea of guys playing when they are healthy and kind of preventing a lot of this load management stuff during the season. That's where I land on it. I think it's certainly, there's a lot of good points on either side of this. There are people that hate the 65 game rule. There are people that think that it was one of the better things that the league has done over the last couple of seasons. And I'm certainly interested to see over the next couple of years, if they don't change the contractual incentives, if we continue to see guys hurt in the first round or some point in the playoffs or towards the end of the season as a result of being forced to play these 65 games, or maybe there isn't any kind of causation, or there is a causation and they don't change the rule, but they change the number of games in the regular season. There's a lot of different avenues that the league can take with this, and it's definitely something I'm just keeping an eye on at the moment.